Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Guanj, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we're joined by two guests to talk about environmental responsibility. First off, we're happy to speak with Drew Pendergrass. Drew is a PhD student in environmental engineering at Harvard University and the co-author of the 2022 book Half-Earth Socialism. His current research uses satellite, aircraft, and surface observations of the environment to correct supercomputer models of the atmosphere. His environmental writing has been in publications such as Harper's and The Guardian. With Drew, we have Filip Mesko. Filip is an architect working between Paris and Auterrive with an emphasis on reuse and renovation. He has lectured at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and at the Architectural Association. Filip was an editor for Half-Earth Socialism and has collaborated with the authors to apply the ideas of the book to architecture. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Drew and Filip. Drew Pendergrass is the co-author of the book Half-Earth Socialism, and Filip Mesko is an architect and one of the editors of the book Half-Earth Socialism. Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you here. I was very looking forward to this episode.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We would love to hear more about you and your background, your whereabouts these days. What are you working on? So anything you would like to cover. Drew, we can start with you if you like.
Sure. So I am a climate scientist living in Boston. By day, I work using satellite data to calculate emissions of various pollutants, greenhouse gases, other pollutants. And then I also work as an environmental activist. So I work with some groups around here where I live. And part of that work is sort of the intellectual work of thinking about what is driving the environmental crisis and how can we overcome it. And that's what the book was about. I collaborated with a historian named Troy Vettese on it. So it's sort of a STEM humanities sort of combined strange amalgam of look at this crisis. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Filip. I am Swedish, but I currently live in Paris since 18 months back or so. I'm an architect, and I work for an office based in the southwest of France called Collectif Encore. And we're about 10 people, and we work mostly with renovations in the countryside. My project is in Paris, so that's why I'm there. And I got dragged into this project as an editor initially, and eventually with both Troy and Drew, we co-authored a paper for architectural design.
Cool. Welcome. Glad to have you both. And for those of you who cannot see Filip, he has this like amazing background, and he's in an incredible space that we all wish that we were in. So enjoy on our behalf. So let's start about and Drew, you kind of gave hints into it already, but a little bit of diagnostics in terms of what you are seeing today or have been seeing that is kind of defining the status quo, right? So what are some of the underlying reasons of the issues we see today, especially when it comes to our Earth?
Yeah, a very big question. I'll just start by talking about this idea of geoengineering. This is something that I encounter a lot in my work at Harvard. So I'm in an engineering department. And one of the quote unquote solutions to climate change that is explored very heavily in my department is this idea of solar geoengineering, which would be flying planes up to the stratosphere, spraying particles to artificially dim the sun, and this would cool the climate. And I think this is a sort of a terrifying technology, and the people who propose it think of it that way too. It's not just me. It would disrupt the climate in unpredictable ways. It might disrupt the monsoon. It would degrade the ozone layer. It would make the sky white. There's all sorts of kind of terrible consequences, but the people who are proposing it are like, well, we haven't really done very much to solve climate change so far, so emergency measures might be necessary. And this might be, they propose it as sort of a temporary means to cool the climate while we work on, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere or something. And it's sort of a disturbingly serious proposal. So people at the public policy school are very interested in it. People in the Biden administration in the US are very interested in geoengineering. There's lots more funding coming out. So I like to start with this as a way of thinking about, the environmental crisis, because it's a way of kind of just laying out the stakes of, our economy, our society is so out of sync with, the natural world that re-engineering nature, in a sense, or re-engineering the climate has become not just a possibility, but a very, very serious proposal. And we kind of take this as a starting off point in the book. We open with a short, like 5 to 10 page dystopia of what might await us, using like ExxonMobil's projections for the future or something like this. And then, the rest of the book is dedicated to thinking about solutions. So, I think this idea of geoengineering is a nice way to conceptualize the scale of this crisis, and our solution in the book is presented kind of as the opposite. So rather than engineering nature to make it safe for our economy to go about its business, we would rather re-engineer the economy, re-engineer society to make it in line with climate and ecological goals.
That is so fascinating. I mean, I think, we often talk about how like we have a climate crisis, right? But because in many areas who are lucky to not see the consequences of it day to day, it's not seen as a crisis. While like, natural disasters, wars, like pandemic, we kind of like see the consequences of everybody like immediately, and therefore like it is more treated like a crisis, and then there's like emergency response. But what's interesting is like what you're saying, well, it's not only a crisis, like these scenarios are actually being like speculated and planned upon as an emergency response. And yet I'm sure like when we maybe like if we were to do like a global survey, many people in our societies may not even know about it, right? While they're still also like questioning, oh, like there is such thing as climate change. What is my role in this, right? So we're so exactly to your point, the gap there is so big. Not only is a crisis and we're like planning or like working on like allocating funding for possible emergency scenarios. And yet like there are so many people who are just don't even know how to come on board or understand what their responsibility as an individual might be. I would like to like dig into that a bit further, because like we're very big on accessible language, like inclusive communications, and for exactly reasons like this, like thinking, in the end, we kind of all are on board, like in whatever is happening, like even though like if it's like against our will or through our will, right? Like we're in the same ship. And yet the gap between like understanding information sharing about everything that's happening is so huge. And when things come, like everything about our planet, right? In the end, we're all like, we're gonna experience the consequences. And in, underserved or marginalized communities, they will even like experience the consequences even more so. And they're not part of the conversation, right? And what we need to be doing. So I would like to dig deep into that a bit further, in terms of, I don't want to say how did we get there? Like I think that's a little bit obvious on how we got there, but in addition to these like emergency scenarios planning, are you seeing kind of like efforts in terms of like, let's make sure people are informed and we're on board and we're trying to get on the same page before we're thinking about like re-engineering climate?
Yeah, I can start this, Philip, and then maybe if you want to jump in. So one of the points we make in the book is we think about this fact that I think you're getting at, which is that we all, or many of us, look at what's going on with the climate and environmental crisis, and we don't like it, right? Like it's not something that we want. And I would even go so far as to say it's not even something that a lot of, big business leaders would want either, right? Part of the point of the book is that we talk a little bit about how capital, not people, is in the driver's seat. As in, like, you could be running a company and you might care about the environment in some sense, but you have to do what makes you a profit, right? You have to do what makes the going rate of profit. And you, as a person who probably doesn't own a company, in this case, you have to work for the people who hire you, right? And you can exercise some moral choices there, and you should, but you're kind of limited by this overall system. So one of the points, one of the overall perspectives of the book is to think about these things as systems, right? These systems are constraining individual actions and the actions of the economy in such a way that no one is in control, and in such a way that it actually becomes easier to conceptualize geoengineering the planet than actually actively intervening and changing the economy in some conscious, deliberate way to avoid these crises. And this is not a coincidence. This is how capitalism works, right? Capitalism works as this sort of unconscious mechanism where no one is in control. And that's sort of the socialism part of the title, right? To put the politics right up front. Like, the socialism part is that we do want to take control of this economic force. We want to democratize it. We want to make it subject to our deliberation. We want to bring in everyone and actually, come to some conclusion together. The book is sort of a plea for democracy, economic democracy, and environmental democracy. What is it that we want to do? Do we want to slow down the economy so that we avoid geoengineering? Do we want to, change the way we produce things? Maybe we'll have a little bit less, but maybe the payoff in terms of a stable climate would be worth it. Yeah, bringing people in, that's sort of the call for the book, and that to have a substantive, deep discussion that's democratic requires that sort of systematic intervention, right? So, it's a very big picture book, right? It's a big picture system change to make the democracy, to make the, the actual, meaningful conversations happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And as an editor, I can also put myself a little bit outside and say that one of the things I think the book does well is to try to integrate a lot of diverse factors that would seem to people in their everyday lives to be very disconnected from each other. They would seem to be a sort of amalgamation of things over-determining the crisis. But I think what the book does well is to try to integrate all of these disparate things into a coherent framework, even though it might be, of course, simple with regards to the complexity that is reality. I still think it tries to synthesize it by taking four main approaches and try to see how they connect to each other through the land use, for example. Yeah. So I think that is also a way that the book tries to, as Drew said, get everyone on board. As it's a kind of open call to engage with these questions in a way that doesn't just overwhelms you or just ends up saying that, oh, but it's also complex, that we need to be, cautious because of the complexity of the world. Because while that may be true, it's no good call to action, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And I would love to zoom into some of like how this might happen, examples from the book in a little bit. I do want to touch upon, I think, like the first, insight and the real underlying reasons of like the problems that we're experiencing today is that disconnect, right? And you're like the lack of information sharing or communication, like that's like one big part of it, which ends up in exclusion, right? Or like, working in silos, which is like creating other problems. We were in Mumbai last year on collaborating on a project related to the carbon neutrality goal that Mumbai has by like 2050. And then the first thing we were like asking, well, the 55% of the population in the city live in informal settlements. Like, how are we getting them on board with this, right? Like, how is like how are we going to move forward if there's so like that immediately like makes me think of that. And also what you said in terms of like systems, there's this amazing book, if you to give it a shout out, and if you haven't read Loonshots by Safi Bakal, and he talks about like the most innovative person in the end becomes the system, right? The system that they operate in, like, and we often see that in like corporations, right? And large institutional organizations, like you might have the best ideas to like move forward with, but how would you be able to realize that? And generally you're restricted by the system itself because you're just like one player or an active agent in that system, but the system is like way more complex than that. So having a systems view, understanding that as a complex system and how we approach a complex system, I think is, even though it's a big concept, it is the only way to go, because we see this the issue, like same issues around like social justice, right, and environmental action and justice too. In the end, there are a lot of systems that are getting in the way of us addressing what we need to address, and the system being also like a capitalist engine. So I would love to hear like some examples you zoom into in terms of maybe like approach that kind of helps you build the framework, and whoever would like to go first.
Well, I'll just give one of the methods that we use in the book that is sort of unusual, but might be appealing, especially to architects, I think, is we have this idea called scientific utopia. And this idea comes from a man named Otto Neurath, who was living at the turn of the 20th century. He's most famous now in the worlds of philosophy of science and in design. He designed this system called isotype, which is sort of like pictogram-based, representations of the world, of the economy. And he designed it because in the late 1910s, so during the German Revolution, he was involved in a very short-lived attempt at, democracy, this experiment in economic planning called the Bavarian Social Republic. And it lasted 6 months before it was destroyed. And he wanted people, even people who couldn't read, to participate in the economy and to participate in planning. And the idea of isotype is that you don't have to read. You can see these pictures that represent, the scale of these economic engines. So because you can see what's going on, you can actively intervene, you can actively control. And we really like this idea of scientific utopia because it captures some of this complexity that you were talking about, like the environment, the environmental system, our energy system, ecology are all complicated, right? Our energy comes from many places, it's consumed in many forms, and we want to change that whole thing, that whole system, right? And we want people to be involved in that and to, make it their own, because we believe very deeply in this idea of economic democracy. But that democracy it requires like sort of technical knowledge, right? So there's this challenge that we kind of wrestle with a bit in this book and in some work that we're doing now on the challenge of having people, with real substantial input into technical systems. And that's sort of where the scientific utopia idea is coming. It's these detailed blueprints for the future that we can talk about and work out together. And there are ways of kind of seeing these incommensurate visions of what could be. So we might have a detailed blueprint for a city with a lot of public transit or a city with a lot of cars. You really can't do both. But this would be a way to, involve people in detailed planning, of something that is technical. And, the details of how this might work in practice are still something that we're thinking about. But I think that overall method of scientific utopia is really interesting. And I think one of the reasons why architects in particular have been drawn to the book, I think I've given more talks at architectural schools than any other type of academic institution, which was strange to me at first. But I think it's because architects do this for a living. Like, the amount of democracy might vary or be pretty limited based on, the world we live in. But, we're building a structure. It requires concrete expertise to build a building. But it's also this sort of zoom out, think about all these things together, all these disparate disciplines have to come together. And I think that's what actually, rebuilding the world requires too. It's that same kind of complete undisciplined, but comprehensive thinking might be a way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and just to add to that with regards to Neurath, a great thing that he does is he starts to problematize the notion of what he calls a universal equivalent. by which you could mean money, for example, or even energy, or anything that is used as a kind of universal substitute to measure and thereby sort of direct things. So he always points to the kind of concrete aspects of whatever you're dealing with. So if you're an architect, you know very well the concrete aspects of the things you're dealing with when you're designing a house, when you're building it. But there's always, in this case, the universal equivalent of money, right? Or now more and more energy, right? And they are very abstract ways of measuring things, and they very seldom speak to the important problems, especially if you're dealing with something like climate crisis or environmental crisis. And I think the example that Neurath uses, correct me if I'm wrong, Drew, but it's something like if you're a commander on a cruise ship, money will not guide your actions where you're supposed to aim your guns or hit a target. It's bad to use a military metaphor, but I think the point comes across pretty well that like there are certain situations, a lot of them actually, where these universal abstract equivalents become meaningless, and yet they are in this society, in a capitalist society, what governs the world, right? And so there's always this tension, I think, and I think Neurath does a great job of highlighting that if you want to build a better society, you have to figure out and you have to kind of institutionalize a way of dealing with these very concrete, disparate, incommensurate factors of reality.
Yeah, so true. And I think, I mean, you touched upon a few things that are lacking in many of our systems today, and we need to build better methods around it. Also getting parties like legal finance on board, right? Because I feel like, some groups might have some idea and then somebody freaks out the other parties and then like nothing happens eventually. And you might be freaked out by like, law and like regulations. Sometimes you get freaked out by like monetary reasons, right? But then I think that's also kind of hinting out into how what we're trying to create in many times is not necessarily co-creative, right? Like there's generally like a group creating something, briefing others, and then others are either on board or not on board, and it's not realized. You touched upon, systems and what's happening, and I think obviously when we think about transparency at scale, and in leadership, there's like a dose of what we can or cannot do. Like we can't share all crises at once with everybody and like freak out people, but at the same time, we need to get people on board on like what's happening and why we're doing it. And if not, something's not going well, why is it not going well, right? Instead of like working like a black box. And then what I'm hearing is, and which is something that is like very near and dear to our heart, we practice inclusive design, and regardless of the discipline that we're in, which basically calls for co-design methods, right? Like how do you co-create with communities? Because there's like an understanding that lived experiences are also equally as important as professional experiences, and that diversity actually nurtures innovation, right? There are studies now coming out showing how diversity fosters innovation. And I think sometimes even even in the design world, like we see when we talk about co-design, people might sometimes, experts, usually architects, designers, get a bit defensive, like we're the designers, right? Or sometimes on with other stakeholders, it's seen as almost like charitable work, like, oh yeah, we engaged communities, but it's not really about that. It's actually like having shared ownership, almost like a sense of belonging in the outcomes that are coming out, which is what we're trying to create. But I think we are like lacking that, like infusing those methodologies in many practices today for various reasons. Sometimes, designers might be aware of it, but there's like an excuse of either like budget or timeline or just like regulation, whatever that might be. Some practices, and Filip, you probably also like come across this, like involve some level of community engagement, which is very not productive. Like here in the US, we have like community board hearings, which is generally like communities informed like the last minute, and they're just like angry and they're yelling and no one listens to each other, and they're like, that was unproductive, let's not do that again. How do we avoid them for like the next year? Which is not like co-creative. So there's a lot of things in the systems that we need to redesign, right? And this is like, how do we rethink our processes, mechanisms that are involved to really start influencing the system? And how do we kind of like almost like influence and inspire this mindset shift of how we create and who should be in the room while we're creating, and how do we create more methods around that. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, and also maybe a thoughts on so I identify as an AI optimist. I feel like if we use AI in the right way, it can help us in so many things that now become an excuse in getting in the way of time and budget, right? It can introduce efficiency to give us space to do this more ethical, critical thinking, and hopefully, right, in an optimistic scenario. So I would love to hear your thoughts on like how co-creation can become more like a method infused into everything, like from urban design to other areas, like even like organizational design, right? As well as how you think AI can be a good player, a good team player in all of this.
Sure. Yeah, I can
Yeah,
start off.
go for it.
But the thing is, I want to start off because I will talk about the small concrete scale, and maybe Drew has the other end of the spectrum. So from the concrete to the abstract, as you'd say. No, but as you said, I encounter this every day. Not the kind of these useless committees in New York that you mentioned, but I think one of the key features in my daily work in this office is that because we operate mostly in the southwest of France, in a rural area, where there is very little in terms of a kind of established architectural, let's call it business, right? Of course, there's architecture, there are architects, there are craftsmen, et cetera, but the kind of the great developers are not here in the same way, especially not inland where we are. And this forces us to work with what is here, and what is here is local associations, local farmers, etc., who often initiate projects together because they usually don't have money to do it by themselves. And even when they go together and pool their resources and do it as a kind of, let's say, a community, they still have very little resources. And what this forces you to do is that they usually come to you to involve you from the beginning. You have no choice. It's not like in the big cities where I've worked before, where you have like a commercial developer who comes to you with a proposal to develop something because they aim ultimately, as Drew said, to make a profit out of it, right? That's in the end, that's what everybody needs to do to survive here. But in this case, of course, there might be some profit involved sometimes, but mostly not. Mostly people work their asses off instead to compensate. We do too, even though we are a commercial office, right? And I think so. These people come to you. They want to build something. They want to create something. If you're involved like this from the beginning, you have to face the challenges that all of these diverse viewpoints bring to the table. And I think what's so rewarding in doing this is that you're constantly challenged, and you have to constantly rework your presuppositions as an architect, what you usually learned in daily practice in a regular commercial setting, and also in architecture school, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what it also does is it creates a kind of way to be what we usually call creative, right? I mean, it's a word that's almost lost its potency, but in a way, I think when you're really challenged, when you barely see any way out of this problem, you have no money, you have all these regulations bearing down, et cetera, et cetera. You have a million people with different opinions, and finding the tunnel out of that mess that's really creativity in a certain sense. And I think the more you do it, the more used to it you get. And I think it really gives me hope for the future, actually. Of course, and this is the last thing I'd say before I hand over to Drew, is that I think a lot of what drives architectural discourse today is also, how do we find an aesthetic language that matches our, commitment to dealing with climatic crisis and environmental crisis. And I think this is not to be something that you figure out in advance and then you apply it, right? It's something that is born out of the practice as you do it. And if you don't have any money to build a staircase, then maybe you replace the first step with a stone that's already on the site. Stuff like that happens all the time here because we have no choice. And it makes a beautiful, unique staircase, right? I mean, this is what I'm trying to get to. So yeah, it makes me happy to be so constrained.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add I think this is what you've both said, I think is really captures this challenge of economic democracy very deeply. And I keep using this word, but I mean, the challenge is that, the way we currently do things, right? Like I've attended some of these community board things and you're told the last second and then there's no involvement, right? And, this is an idea that a lot of people have thought about. In a new book that Troy and I, my co-author, are working on, we're talking a lot about, these experiments with direct democracy that kind of flourished in the 60s, and they were inspired by many things, among them ancient Athens. And the idea of these direct democracy systems is that you get ordinary people and you really believe that ordinary people can govern, and you bring them together and then they come up with these ideas. This is sort of the idea of citizens assemblies, which is in the climate movement. You just get regular people together to come up with these ideas, and it is amazing what people come up with. I think there's sort of a strange skepticism of democracy in the air at the moment. I think it's because of the rise of things like the far right and these movements, which are quite scary. And I think some people react to this by thinking democracy is, this maybe terrifying thing, and maybe we don't want it. But I think that the opposite might be true. The opposite being, like, if you actually put people together and give them these sort of constrained problems that Filip is thinking about, and people, are given actual responsibilities, it's sort of amazing what they can come up with. And these experiments, and there are experiments with this in places like Brazil, these citizen, committees of like thousands of people who have their own procedures for coming up with these ideas. Yeah, I mean, I think these things really, really can work, but you have to put democracy at the foundation as this foundational value from the beginning. And the people who are in charge are ultimately, the community. And they might, ask experts for opinions, they might learn things themselves. But that sort of flipping the script, rather than, the experts are in charge and they consult the community at the end, the community is in charge and they consult the experts. And thinking about a system that was built on that sort of value, that's sort of the utopian aspect of our book. Utopian in a good sense, I would hope.
Yeah, you're both talking about like the same thing, almost like where Filip is like giving like a very practical day-to-day example of what you're saying in terms of like the overall vision, like having everyone on board from the beginning, right? Like in the journey. And yes, like I think we can like take it for like as given, there will always be budget, time, regulatory, whatever constraints, right? That's not going anywhere anytime soon. In maybe in like the well, unless we like, implode the system. But what you do with that, and there's this like great word called jugad in Hindi, which basically refers to innovation that comes out because of lack of resources. It's like almost like frugal innovation. So that's like what you're talking about, Filip, in terms of like the creativity too. In those moments when you're working all together, you find a way to do it. And that is like, that's such a rewarding outcome. And it's also showing that, we're not talking about consensus here. Sometimes, like when I talk about co-design, there's like one designer's reaction was like, a camel is a horse designed by consensus or something. Like I think that's like that's the saying. So he was basically like showing no interest in like co-design, which like we're not talking about consensus. We're talking about having people together, critically discussing things, and coming to decisions. Maybe there's a utilitarian approach, right? Like maybe the majority vote wins, whatever that is. But in the end, there's discussion, there's debate. But there's sense of ownership from the beginning in the process, which makes people care more about the outcomes. They feel included, they feel that they belong, and therefore they act, right? And I think as we exclude, then like we see people not taking part or becoming skeptic or not trusting. There's huge distrust towards any large institution or organization for exactly these reasons. And what we're talking about in both like a project practical scale level is that would also, like, if we were to populate and scale that, that's how we can like create our systems. And I would love to go back to also like how you see AI can support all of this or not. What is the dystopian version of this, or like maybe like a great speculative scenario?
I think in terms of AI, when you said it before, I was thinking that you said, it can create some sort of efficiency to help you do things better or concentrate more on the things that are important. And I would just respond by saying efficiency for whom, for what purpose? Like usually we only need a lot of the efficiency we think we need because we are in this mess, right? And the system, this society that, oh, I need to get this out of the way so I can focus on what's important. Already there you have a problem, right? That it won't be solved by just being more efficient. It will be solved by making this need for efficiency redundant. And I think if AI can do this, then fine, but I don't see AI as being a solution in itself to this problem. And frankly, I'm not very interested in what it can and cannot do in itself, yeah.
I'll say that, we think a little bit about technology in this book. So the ways in which, things like algorithms can come in service of this sort of planning objective that we're talking about here. So, a way to, where you have this democracy first, but then you have tools available that can help solve problems. So it might be, we come up with these ideas and then we design this technical system that accomplishes those objectives. And that technical system will draw on what's been produced before. But, if we design things from democracy first, the technical systems will probably look different from the ones we have now, because the people designing our technical systems now are trying to make a profit. Not their fault. That's how things work. And those things are often very powerful. But the systems that we would design, with this, bottom-up democracy sort of vision might be different in important ways. So on the point of AI, I mean, I suppose it depends. I mean, I think these computer algorithms, many of which are clustered under AI, can be very, very useful, can be very powerful. But I think, the way AI is trained on past data. So it might be a great way to plumb experience or to plumb what has been done before, or to produce something, that is typical. And that might be useful. There are cases where that might be useful. But yeah, I think, thinking about those constraints. So I guess it would be a case by case basis for me in terms of the role of technology in these problems, but the value of that democracy and the value of us consciously solving these crises ourselves, that comes first, and then whatever tool is necessary, that we can talk about that then.
Is the tool that would support. But also, Philip, you made a great point in terms of like the reason why we even need that efficiency is one of the problems, right? So if that's not challenging the system, that's serving the system, which could create like these patchwork fixes, maybe like we will find temp solutions to things, but we're then still not addressing the real problem that we have. I envision like my best case scenario is if you watch Iron Man. I was like, I imagine AI as Jarvis, and then we're all Iron Man, and we're like, it's not about profit, it's about serving the greater good and humanity. And then Jarvis allows us to become superhumans, but this also like there has to be democracy around it, right? It can't be like a few elites has access to Jarvis, and then they're like doing whatever they want. It's more like everybody has a Jarvis, and how does that make us like that empowers us, we all become Avengers, but are we using that power for good? I think that's again like the bigger question that we might have. And so that's like my ultimate like best vision of like AI. But of course, like getting there may not be that feasible. But in the meantime, can AI help us create these like tools that might, help with like redundant work or like excavating stuff from like past, to your point, Drew, that will speed those up for us to become like we can ideate further or question things further. But again, are we still serving the system that we're in and playing with that, or are we like rethinking a system would be the bigger question. Go ahead.
No, maybe Drew, I want to prompt you to maybe just talk a little bit about linear programming in this regard, because it's a very kind of simple technology which goes a long way, and I think it addresses some of the problem that are faced in the kind of so-called calculation debate, where complexity is not always, the way forward. But we can skip it if we're out of time.
No, please.
I'll be quick. So, I mean, we talk a little bit about, an example technology. This is the AI of the 50s in a sense. So linear programming is an optimization method. It optimizes a function in the space of constraints. And it was designed in the Soviet Union to optimize plywood production at a factory. So the idea is you have these different machines, you need to produce this different output. How can we design this factory better? And there's all sorts of interesting politics and of internal struggles for reform in the Soviet Union that we talk a little bit about in the book. But the nice thing about this algorithm is that it allows you to kind of lay out what the constraints are. And in the environmental world, we have constraints. So we might want to limit our use of land. We might want to limit our energy. We might want to prefer energy from certain sources. All these different constraints come into play. And then the linear program is a very useful way to reduce our decision space and sort of show us what the possibilities are. It's a very simple tool. And the thing that I like about it is it's extremely transparent. Like the way it works is even if you haven't taken calculus in a long time, it has this very intuitive function. And I think this is why it's an extremely popular tool today. So companies use linear programming all the time. Our energy infrastructure is often designed with linear programming tools. It's an algorithm that is all over the place. And we play with this idea in the book as a way to enable people to do planning, right? Like we lay out the constraints and then the linear program kind of offers concrete illustrations of solutions, and those can prompt further conversations. So some tools like other algorithms, including forms of AI, might be able to serve a similar function, and that would be again that fits with this idea of planning, but I think that transparency aspect is really powerful, and that's something to think about with AI algorithms, which are less transparent. The power of a generative AI is deeply linked to its kind of internal function being very hard to understand. So that's another thing to keep in mind in terms of these algorithms and their uses.
Yeah, and how they're trained on data sets who people in low-income countries are employed to sift through with severe consequences for their mental well-being, et cetera, et cetera. So there are multiple issues with that as well. But I think I'd just like to add as a final, I think what the example of linear program shows is that it's not really the technology that is at the crux of the issue. It's the deliberation that it allows afterwards when you have these concrete examples and you get together and you deliberate on them and then maybe you make decisions. So I think if to exaggerate a little bit, if you can't get where you want to go without technology, maybe that's not where you should go, right? The technology could help you a certain way, but I think, do we need it at all? Most of the problems in this world that we need to solve, I think, personally, we could do without a lot of these advanced technologies. It's rather a social and political problem than a technical one.
Yeah, you're almost saying it could give you like ideation prompts to talk upon, but it's not actually like driving the solution. It's in the end, like we need to come to those like decisions ourselves. And to your point, like where we were talking about like infusing more transparency, how AI works is very much not that, and also very much infused with bias. So even if we like include it in our process, we need to also acknowledge the bias that it holds for various reasons, lack of data or bias of the team that developed it or like fed the system, like the models and things like that. So well, I mean, I think like we can go on about this forever. I'm really enjoying this conversation, but I do want to be mindful of our time. So I do want to ask, obviously, in these complex systems with wicked problems, it can get very paralyzing sometimes, especially if you want to have like a systems view, like what can I do? Like, what is my role then? Like, what do I do? So for anyone who wants to make progress, push boundaries, I don't want to say disrupt because I feel like there's no disrupting tomorrow. We need to like build a stone on top of each other. Like what would be your advice to anyone who would like to shift things a little?
I can start and try to be very brief. I think when I was much younger, I was in a position that I think a lot of people are in, and that you look around the world and you see a lot of things that are fucked up. and you try to make sense of it, and this usually leads to some sort of despair or another. I think one of the comforting things is when you kind of reach a point where you think that you have understood something, a way through this maze. And this can, of course, be, maybe it's fascism or something, and that's not very good. But I think, I think at a certain point, you can start to identify a kind of the dynamics of, let's say, the determining dynamics of the system that is capitalism, that we, no matter whether we want it or not, live under, unfortunately. And once you kind of identify this dynamic, I think it really ties everything together in a sort of way that might sound conspiratorial, but I think gets to the heart of the matter, which is we have to work in order to live, basically. We have to work to gain money, because with money we can exchange the goods we need to survive as biological beings. And this is crudely put, but I think it gets to the core of the issue. And if you can start to create a way of living in the world together with others, of course, that starts to circumvent this logic, I think that's where you can find a way forward that will also make you a lot happier, probably. And this is not easy, but I think it's very fulfilling. And this does not mean that you go local and you don't care about the bigger scale. That's not it at all. But I think you need to start with the basic premises of the society that, as Drew said, nobody's in charge, really. It's the kind of mute compulsion, as Marx calls it. And yeah, focus the attack there. If you can drive a dagger through that heart, the beast dies.
That's the title of the episode.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Philip makes a very important point. I think, if you're one person, one person cannot do take on these things themselves. So I think the lessons for me are things like, these sorts of democratic systems we've talked about, this whole thing, participate in building those. Some of the most inspiring moments of my life have not been in, workplace proper, but in things like, doing environmental organizing around me in Boston. And, I'm in a union for graduate students, so working with other graduate students to like define, what we want to push for. Those sorts of, islands of democracy, of like deep democracy, are really precious and are really powerful to build. And the more people who participate in them, I think the more power we have to spread that sort of that sort of system where we have these behaviors that we've been talking about in this episode, these alternatives, these concrete utopias, as Eric Olin Wright talks about, or real utopias. So there's that, and then I think on that point, it's linking up with people. So it's it's coming together around these common goals, and and forming these sorts of movements. And then your professional career, if you end up being sort of in this sort of technical role, as I think many of the people listening might be, trying to be creative about how you can make that an island of democracy too. I think that's, we live in a very complicated world that has a lot of technical expertise. And I think it is, as a professional, if you're listening to this, I think an exciting and underexplored venue of what you can do personally in your career proper is trying to get past that technical barrier, trying to think about how does scientific utopia work in whatever it is that you do. Science is very hard. Science is famously extremely opaque and not inclusive. So this is my personal work, and it's hard, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah, I love this. I mean, it's so human. In the end, it's like starts off with like find your people and organize, right? But then like how do you reflect that into your like day to day? And you're like a great example, like from both sides of the world is like almost like coming together and working on something that is also like pushing us to ideate and question, things. And I think that like constructive thinking, hopefully we don't lose that no matter which system we're working at in or we're part of. So thank you so much. This was such a treat. I recommend everybody to read the book and also follow upcoming books from Drew, and where Filip will be officially and unofficially editing in the back end. And like keep us posted on what's next.
Absolutely.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you. It's been
Thank
fun.
you.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week.